Hi, this is Peter Wheelhauer. This is the third video in our series on an introduction to quantitative political analysis. And in this little video, we're going to look at main characteristics of scientific political knowledge. What distinguishes scientific knowledge from other kinds of knowledge? There are three primary characteristics of scientific political knowledge. The first is that it's empirical. The second, that it's subject to empirical verification. And the third is that it's transmissible. By empirical, we mean that any kind of knowledge claim we make is actually based on observation and experience, not merely somebody's opinion, not your superstition or common sense. Although it's worth noting that the opinions that people hold, sometimes they're superstitions, sometimes common sense notions, certainly lots of other non-empirical foundations stimulate empirical research questions. But fundamentally, if we're going to have scientific political knowledge, that knowledge itself is built off of observation and experience. And we're making a knowledge claim, we're making that based upon what we see and the information that we can gather, not based merely on what we think might be going on. There is room for speculation, but it's not the same thing. There's a difference between our speculation and the empirical side of our knowledge. When we say that scientific political knowledge is subject to empirical verification, what that means, coming out of the first idea or the first characteristic, is that any kind of a knowledge claim that we make, that is what we think we know, has to be assessed using systematic research methods that are empirical in nature, not merely arguments. Look, very important works have been written that are primarily argumentative, that tell compelling stories, or that develop really interesting and thoughtful models and expectations and discussions about politics and society. But what makes a bit of knowledge or something scientific is whether or not that actually has been used by systematic, empirical, observational methods, analytical methods, not merely the arguments. Arguments are important, and moral arguments are important, those kinds of things. I'm not dismissing those at all, but there's a difference between kind of normative and moral discussions and prescriptive kinds of ideas and empirical reasons, empirical relationships, empirical facts. Third characteristic of scientific political knowledge is that the researchers who are gathering that, this is a critical piece, is that they clearly communicate the processes by which that information is gathered and the analysis is executed. And the main concept here is that we always want others to be looking at our work and to be critiquing our work. So an important part of the scientific process is being systematic in our thinking, gathering information based on observations, analyzing that in a clear and specific way, and then communicating that clearly to others. And then an important part of this also is a willingness to take whatever your results are, to take your data and make it available to other people so that they can evaluate your work. This is absolutely a critical process in the scientific process, because without this kind of checks and balances, then anybody could say anything they want to and make any kind of claim that they want to, and the validity of that could not really be questioned. One of the best things about the scholarly community is their ability to evaluate the research that other people have done. Of course, this creates a problem because the reviewers are subject to the same kinds of cognitive bias problems that the original authors are. So a multiplicity of observers and critiques are really important for evaluating the empirical information that people are claiming to have found. Now, an important part of thinking through empirical evidence is thinking through the thresholds of how much evidence we need. to conclude that a relationship exists. So let's say, for example, that we're trying to evaluate the relationship between polarization in Congress and the ability of a president to get a Supreme Court nominee approved. Well, in order to execute that kind of analysis, I have to have some kind of an understanding about the thresholds for how much evidence do I need to be persuaded this is true, or be convinced that this is that something is true. And so this happens actually in all of life. This isn't distinct to political science or to the natural sciences. But this question about how much evidence you need to be convinced of something is terribly important, because it comes into play in all areas of life. So you might often say, for example, how much evidence do you need before you are willing to believe that planes are safe to fly in? How much evidence do you need about safety in the workplace before you're willing to go to work, or step outside your door, or drive a car, or be a passenger in a car? We act all the time based on evidence that is good enough. We almost never need 100% confidence that something is true in order for us to act as if it is true, right? Or to be convinced that it's true. So I think the planes are by and large safe to fly in. I don't understand the physics of it, but I see lots and lots of evidence of safe planes flying and relatively little evidence of planes on their own crashing. So on balance, if I have to take a long trip, I'm likely to fly because I have pretty strong evidence based on my observation and based on other people's observations that I trust that planes are safe. Is it 100% certainty that a plane will be safe? No, there's never 100% certainty of that. But that's an example of how I have to operate on the basis of good enough evidence, a good enough standard of proof that flying is safe. Now, we can apply this in all kinds of areas of life. So let's look at a handful of these. And I'm picking out 4 areas that are really common in which the idea of proving things is really important. Now, when we think about criminal law, this is the area of law that talks about somebody who's been charged by the government with a crime. Think about somebody who's charged with armed robbery or charged with murder. What hinges on this is somebody's life, right? Are you going to deprive them of their freedom for a fixed amount of time? If it's a capital offense, somebody could die on the basis of this proof standard. So what is the level of proof of guilt that a jury needs in a criminal case? When they're hearing a criminal case, what's the level of proof they need? What's what we call the proof standard? By now, you've probably answered already. Beyond a reasonable doubt. When juries receive their instructions, they are told by judges, you don't need 100% certainty that the person is guilty. You need to be certain beyond a reasonable doubt, a moral level of certainty that this person is the one who did this crime. That is explicitly not 100% proof. It just has to be beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's a pretty high threshold. If you've ever sat on a jury, you know how high a threshold that is. You've got to have really, really good evidence, but not 100% certainty. In civil law, this is when one person is suing another person, or one entity is suing another entity, say that they're responsible, they should have done this. In civil law, what is the standard of proof? The phrase that's used is called preponderance of the evidence. So in this case, when somebody's suing somebody else for an offense or for or breach of contract or something, or failure to deliver, those kinds of things, the threshold that juries are given when considering the case is the preponderance of the evidence. Basically, that means something like 51% of the evidence leans in the direction of the person being responsible. 49% means if it's only 49%, then that's not the preponderance of the evidence. So you can be like 51% sure, and that is what's necessary. That's the necessary proof standard for being found responsible in civil law. There's nowhere near 100% certainty that's needed. If you take a history course or you take a philosophy course, it is often the case that there is not any kind of a 100% proof that one thing caused something else, or the one set of factors is the best explanation for something. Instead, you use something called abductive reasoning. That is, you lay out a variety of possible explanations and you work your way through what is the best explanation for the thing I'm trying to understand. That's called abductive reasoning. And in this case, it's not a 100% proof standard either. So our people who study history, historians, philosophers, they don't require 100% proof. What they require is that you demonstrate that you've got the best explanation compared with other explanations. Finally, in this class, we're going to be using statistical reasoning, and the primary tool for evaluating a proof in the natural sciences and in political science is statistics. We use statistics more than these other areas, and we have a set of rules and principles that we use for setting proof standards. The way that we do this is really 3 steps. First, we calculate the probabilities that certain outcomes happen. So think about the probability of flipping a coin, and what's the probability of heads versus tails? Well, do the same thing with in more complex ways with rolling dice or picking a card out of a deck. We can do the same thing for other kinds of politically interesting outcomes. We can also take the results that we have and use a variety of tools to calculate how much of the thing that we're trying to understand have we explained. So if we're trying to explain why members of Congress vote the way they do, can we explain 100%? Do we require 100% proof before we go with our model? No, we're pretty happy with being able to explain 25 or 50 or even 80 or 90%, but not 100% of the thing that we're interested in. And then an important part of the statistical reasoning process is that when we express our results, we never talk about proving. Even though the concept here is a proof standard, we actually never really say that we've proven anything. Instead, we express our confidence in our results as probabilities. I'm 99% sure that this is the case. Or I'm only 60% sure that this happens, so I'm not going to go out on a limb and draw the conclusion. So we express our confidence in results as probabilities, not as 100% proof that things have taken place. Now, what's interesting is that in terms of the use of statistics, the natural sciences and the social sciences use the same basic standards. I'm interested when I go to read a nursing journal, for example. I'm a political scientist, but when I go to read a nursing journal article on something that I'm interested in or something I'm concerned about, I understand their statistics because they're using the same statistics that I use as a political scientist, right? And so the fact that they're using the same statistics and the same basic procedures for communicating their scientific research, I can read that research and understand what they're talking about. So even in those research projects, when we think about medical research, that's extremely important because the results there affects people's actual living day in and day out. They use the same tools and the same statistical standards as we do in the social sciences. Now, one of the things that I think is very important for us to notice here is that in none of these cases, criminal law, civil law, history, philosophy, even using statistical reason in scientific and social scientific research, that none of these proof standards require 100% assurance that something is the case. And in fact, when those of us who use statistics, we do not talk about 100% assurance. We talk about being extremely confident. We got 99% sure or 99.9% sure, but we don't require 100% confidence in order to conclude that something is true or that a relationship actually exists between the things that we're studying. So part of what we need to move beyond as scientists and social scientists is to not worry so much about getting complete proof, complete answers, and instead just be intellectually honest about what we do get. So if we have a good model that explains 75% of something, then we communicate, I explained 75% of this. The other 25%, I don't know. So it's okay for us to say that. And how confident am I that I'm right? Yeah, I'm 99% sure I'm right. I'm 90% sure that I'm right. In most cases, for social sciences anyway, that's good enough. We don't require 100% proof to be confident. So to wrap things up, when we're thinking about the characteristics of scientific political knowledge, it's got to be based on observation, it's got to be empirical, it's got to be clearly communicated to others, and that when we're talking about how much evidence we're using, that our scientific political knowledge does not require complete 100% proof of something. We just need to know things confidently enough in order for us to run to a conclusion, just like a jury is when they're deciding whether or not somebody committed murder.